You think African American ground beef recipes were just hamburgers and spaghetti? Think again. Black kitchens across the South transformed this humble meat into dozens of dishes that carried families through hard times with creativity and love. Here are 60 forgotten African American ground beef recipes no one makes anymore.
Corned beef and cabbage with rice and gravy was the plate lunch special that filled workers up and kept them going until supper. A mound of white rice was topped with sliced corned beef and braised cabbage, then covered generously with gravy made from the cooking liquid. The gravy soaked into the rice, flavoring every grain while the cabbage and meat provided substance. This was cafeteria food, blue plate special food served at diners and lunch counters across Black neighborhoods. It was affordable, filling, and deeply satisfying. Workers ordered it, knowing exactly what they would get: consistency and comfort. The rice stretched the meal further while the gravy tied everything together. Corned beef and cabbage with rice was everyday food that people genuinely loved and looked forward to ordering.
Ground beef and rice stuffed bell peppers were the kind of dish your grandparents saved for Sundays or for the rare evenings when the family needed something that felt like a celebration. Bell peppers were sliced open and hollowed out, then filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, onions, and tomatoes, seasoned just the way older cooks liked: slow, steady, and full of heart. As the peppers baked, their edges softened and their sweetness deepened, turning each one into a small, edible bowl of comfort. Some families topped them with breadcrumbs for a crisp finish. Others added cheese when it was available, but the real magic came from the filling. The rice made the beef stretch further. The tomatoes kept everything moist, and the peppers held it all together in a way that felt generous. Children loved the presentation, adults loved the flavor, and everyone loved how a single pepper felt like a full meal. These stuffed peppers carried the spirit of a time when food did not need to be complicated to feel meaningful. They tasted like gatherings, like quiet afternoons spent around a worn kitchen table. And even now, one bite brings back memories of home. Beef and potato hash was the master of second chances. It began as a way to save leftovers from Sunday dinner and ended as breakfast that could make anyone smile. Ground beef and diced potatoes fried together in a skillet until golden and crisp, seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and sometimes a little onion or hot sauce. The edges crackled, the smell was irresistible, and the flavor was pure comfort. It was the kind of meal you could eat any time of day, morning, noon, or midnight. For working families, it was a quick fix that still felt full and satisfying. You could feed 6 with just a handful of ingredients, and no one left the table hungry. Hash was proof that waste was not in the vocabulary of a wise cook. Every bite tasted like resourcefulness and care, the kind of wisdom only learned from years of making do. The skillet did not just fry food, it told stories of survival. Southern beef croquettes with pan sauce were the kind of dish grandparents made when there was just a little ground beef left and every bit needed to count. The meat was mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and seasonings, then shaped into small croquettes meant to stretch what would have otherwise fed only 2 people. Once formed, they were fried until the outside turned crisp and golden, while the inside stayed tender and warm. The pan sauce came from the drippings left behind, cooked with onions and a splash of broth until it thickened into something rich enough to make the meal feel complete. Families often served croquettes with rice or mashed potatoes, letting the sauce soak through everything on the plate. These croquettes were born from resourcefulness, but they never tasted like compromise. They tasted like care, experience, and the quiet pride that came from turning leftovers into something memorable. Southern beef croquettes with pan sauce were proof of how older cooks made even the smallest amount feel abundant.
Corned beef and cabbage with navy beans was the hearty combination that turned one pot into a complete meal of protein and vegetables. Small white navy beans were simmered in the corned beef broth until creamy, their mild flavor absorbing the salty, meaty liquid. cabbage wedges cooked alongside until tender, creating a dish that was both filling and nutritious. Families valued this combination because dried beans were cheap and stored well, making them reliable additions to any pot. The navy beans broke down slightly, thickening the broth into something almost like gravy. This dish was often made in large batches that fed families for days, reheating beautifully each time. It represented the wisdom of stretching resources while maintaining flavor and satisfaction. Navy beans made corned beef and cabbage substantial enough to stand alone.
Peanut-seasoned ground beef stew carried the quiet influence of West African cooking traditions, where peanuts were used to thicken stews and enrich their flavor. Grandparents browned the beef first, then added onions, peppers, and garlic before stirring in peanuts or peanut butter to create a rich, velvety base. Tomatoes and broth helped everything blend together, turning the stew into something warming and deeply satisfying. The peanuts added a subtle sweetness and a creamy texture that made the meal feel more substantial than its cost suggested. Families served it with rice or bread, letting the stew soak into every bite. This was food shaped by heritage, memory, and the blending of old techniques with new ingredients. Peanut-seasoned ground beef stew was not just nourishing, it was a quiet celebration of roots carried across generations. Beef and black-eyed pea chili brought together the heartiness of soul food and the boldness of the American South. Instead of red kidney beans, cooks used black-eyed peas, earthy, soft, and full of history. Ground beef browned in the pot with onion, garlic, and chili powder before the peas and tomatoes joined in. The stew thickened as it simmered, bubbling until the flavors blended perfectly. It was a meal for cold nights or busy days, eaten with cornbread or crackers on the side. The texture was rich and filling, every spoonful a mix of spice and comfort. This chili was never about heat alone. It was about depth, about turning simple ingredients into something bold. Families passed down their own versions, some smoky, some sweet, but always hearty. It was proof that tradition could adapt without losing its soul. Even today, a bowl of black-eyed pea chili feels like a reminder of where flavor truly begins.
Corned beef and cabbage casserole was the dish that turned leftovers into company food, layered and baked until bubbly and golden. Sliced corned beef lined the bottom of a buttered baking dish, covered with a layer of sautéed cabbage, then topped with creamy mashed potatoes. Some families added cheese for extra richness. The casserole baked until the edges crisped and the layers melded together into something greater than their parts. It was made for potlucks and church suppers where it traveled well and served easily. The presentation elevated humble ingredients into something impressive. Children often preferred the casserole to boiled dinner because of the crispy edges and creamy texture. Corned beef and cabbage casserole represented the transformation of necessity into celebration.
Picnic-style beef sandwich spread was a staple of church gatherings, school lunches, and community events where feeding many with little was an art perfected by older generations. Ground beef was cooked with onions, seasoned gently, then mixed into a creamy spread made with mustard, mayonnaise, or relish depending on the cook's preference. The mixture chilled until firm, then was spread thick on soft bread or crackers. It was simple, filling, and easy to transport, making it ideal for long days spent outdoors or in fellowship halls. Children loved the mild, savory flavor, adults appreciated how far a single batch could go, and everyone knew exactly how comforting one of these sandwiches could be. Picnic-style beef sandwich spread was proof that practical food could still carry warmth and memory. Beef and rice croquettes were the quiet stars of every church supper and community picnic, the kind of dish that traveled from kitchen to fellowship hall in warm foil pans. They turned yesterday's rice and leftover ground beef into something golden, fragrant, and entirely new. Mixed with diced onions, beaten eggs, and a pinch of salt and pepper, the mixture was rolled by hand into smooth, firm rounds before meeting the hot oil. The sizzle that followed was a sound every cook knew by heart. As they fried, the croquettes crisped on the outside and softened inside, creating that perfect balance of texture and warmth. The first bite filled the air with smoke, spice, and comfort. People dipped them in mustard or gravy, but most just ate them plain because they were already perfect. They were food meant to be shared, passed down long tables between laughter and small talk. Their smell alone could draw children into the kitchen, waiting for the next batch to come out of the pan. Every tray emptied faster than it was filled, leaving crumbs and smiles behind. These croquettes proved that celebration did not need wealth. It only needed heart, time, and a little imagination to turn simple ingredients into something worth remembering. Field green salad was a dish born from foraging, when store-bought vegetables were not available or were too costly. Families would gather wild greens like dandelion, mustard, or pokeweed, clean them carefully, and toss them with vinegar or oil. These greens were bitter, but they were free, nutritious, and available almost everywhere. Field green salad offered vitamins and freshness that was often missing from wartime or depression diets, balancing the heavy starches and salted meats that dominated many meals. For children, it was sometimes an acquired taste, but adults appreciated the practicality of gathering what nature provided. Foraging for greens tied families directly to the land and created a sense of connection to survival practices passed down through generations. Field green salad reflected both hardship and resilience, reminding families that the earth itself could provide when markets could not. It was simple, frugal, and a reminder of the strength that came from resourcefulness. Okra and ground beef stew was one of the quiet staples your grandparents relied on during weeks when money was thin, but supper still needed to be hearty. The stew began with browning the ground beef, letting onions soften in its juices until they turned clear and fragrant. Then came the sliced okra, fresh from a garden, or traded from a neighbor who always had plenty. Okra thickened the stew as it cooked, turning the broth rich and velvety without needing anything extra. Tomatoes, peppers, and a bit of broth followed, creating a pot that smelled earthy and warm. Some families added corn or lima beans, others tossed in leftover vegetables that needed to be used. As the stew simmered, the flavors blended into something far deeper than the ingredients alone. Your grandparents ladled it into bowls with pride, knowing it was nourishing, comforting, and built to last. Okra and ground beef stew was a reminder of how families thrived through lean seasons with creativity and patience. Dirty rice with ground beef was the story of flavor traveling and staying alive. Born from Louisiana kitchens, it took the essence of Creole spice and turned it into an everyday meal. Ground beef stood in for the traditional organ meats, making it affordable and accessible while keeping that smoky, seasoned soul. The rice cooked with bell pepper, onion, garlic, and green onion until each grain shimmered with flavor. Cayenne added heat, thyme added depth, and every forkful carried the memory of the South. Dirty rice was not fancy. It was the people's food, filling, bold, and proud of its roots. It made something extraordinary out of what was ordinary, turning simple rice and beef into a dish worth remembering. Served with hot sauce or a slice of cornbread, it brought warmth to every table it touched. Some recipes fade quietly, but this one lingers like a good song, humming with history and spice.
Corned beef and cabbage with lima beans was the combination that added creamy texture and extra protein to the pot. Large lima beans were simmered alongside the cabbage in the corned beef broth until they became soft and buttery. The beans absorbed the salty liquid and provided substance that made the dish even more filling. Families who grew lima beans in their gardens added them naturally to whatever was simmering. The combination was especially popular in rural areas where dried beans were pantry staples that stretched meals through lean times. Children who might complain about plain limas ate them willingly when they tasted of corned beef. This variation showed the resourcefulness of cooks who understood how to make one pot feed many. Lima beans turned corned beef and cabbage into something heartier and more complete.
Beef and black-eyed pea casserole was a dish that often appeared around the new year, when black-eyed peas symbolized hope and good fortune. Ground beef gave the casserole its richness, while the peas brought warmth and tradition to the pan. Onions, peppers, and rice were usually added, turning the dish into a complete meal that stretched far without stretching the budget. Everything baked together until the flavors melded into something comforting and familiar. Some families added tomatoes, others topped the casserole with cheese, but every version carried the same sense of celebration. This was a meal meant to gather people at the table, to welcome good days ahead with humble but meaningful ingredients. Beef and black-eyed pea casserole tasted like optimism seasoned with memory. Ground beef and butter bean stew came from the days when you made what you had and made it last. Butter beans simmered slow with beef, onion, and tomato until the pot turned thick and smoky. The beans softened and soaked up every ounce of flavor, creating a meal that was hearty without being heavy. A little salt pork or smoked paprika gave it depth, while cornbread on the side made it complete. This was Depression-era cooking that endured because it worked. It filled bellies, cost little, and tasted like more than it was. Families would gather around steaming bowls after long days, grateful for food that stayed simple and honest. The stew told a story of resilience, one spoonful at a time. Even today, it stands as a reminder that good food has never been about excess. It has always been about heart.
Corned beef and cabbage pie was the kind of dish that transformed leftovers into something that looked like it took all day. A buttery pie crust lined a deep dish filled with layers of chopped corned beef, sautéed cabbage, onions, and diced potatoes bound with eggs and cream. The top crust was crimped and vented, then baked until golden brown and the filling set firm. Sliced into wedges, it served beautifully at dinner tables and traveled well to potlucks. The pie elevated humble ingredients into something that commanded attention. Families made it when company was coming or when leftovers needed to become something special. Each slice contained all the flavors of the original dish in portable, impressive form. Corned beef and cabbage pie showed that presentation mattered and creativity could transform anything.
Beef and turnip green pot was a meal made for days when families needed something filling, earthy, and deeply nourishing. Turnip greens simmered down beautifully, softening into the broth while keeping their distinct flavor. When cooked with ground beef, onions, and simple seasoning, the pot gained a richness that felt far greater than its ingredient list. This was the kind of meal grandparents learned to make from those who came before them, people who knew how to coax comfort out of whatever the land offered. Turnip greens grew quickly and grew strong, making them a reliable vegetable even in difficult seasons. As the pot simmered, the greens absorbed the beef juices and took on a tenderness that made every spoonful satisfying. Families ate it with cornbread or rice, letting the juices soak into each bite. Beef and turnip green pot was food made with wisdom, thrift, and a deep understanding of how to feed many with few resources. It tasted like tradition carried forward. Beef and cabbage fry-up was a skillet classic that defined thrift and taste. In rural kitchens, a single pound of ground beef met a mountain of chopped cabbage, onions, and a little butter or lard to bring it all together. Everything cooked down until soft and caramelized, the flavors blending into something far greater than the sum of its parts. The beef added richness, the cabbage sweetness, and the result was hearty enough to feed a family of 6. It was everyday food, fast, affordable, and nourishing. You could eat it with cornbread, rice, or just straight from the pan. The sizzle and smell felt like home, simple but full of love. This dish proved that care did not depend on wealth, but on attention and patience. It may not look like much, but it filled stomachs and hearts in equal measure. Beef and cabbage fry-up was a quiet victory on hard days, and every bite tasted like gratitude.
Corned beef and cabbage fried rice was the dish that gave Asian technique a soul food twist, using leftover ingredients to create something entirely new. Day-old rice was fried in a hot wok or skillet with chopped corned beef, shredded cabbage, eggs, and green onions until everything was slightly crispy and fragrant. Soy sauce or Worcestershire added depth while the cabbage provided sweetness. This dish appeared in households where creativity meant survival and leftovers became tomorrow's dinner. It was quick to prepare and satisfying, perfect for busy weeknights when time was short. Children loved the crispy rice bits scattered throughout. Corned beef and cabbage, fried rice showed how African American cooks borrowed freely from other traditions while making dishes their own. It was fusion before fusion had a name.
Beef tomato rice dressing was a coastal Louisiana staple, the kind of dish meant to feed a crowd with flavor rather than expensive ingredients. Ground beef was browned with onions, celery, and peppers, then simmered with tomatoes until everything cooked down into a savory mixture. Rice absorbed the juices, turning fluffy and richly seasoned as it baked or simmered together with the meat. The result was a pot full of warmth, depth, and unmistakable Southern character. Families made it for gatherings, holidays, and days when there were more people at the table than usual. It was simple, reliable, and beloved, carrying the taste of home even for those who moved far from the coast. Beef tomato rice dressing was proof that good food did not need extravagance, only tradition and a steady hand. Rice-topped meatloaf cups were an invention of practicality and care. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, onion, and egg was pressed into muffin tins to bake into small personal meatloaves. Once out of the oven, each cup was topped with a spoonful of fluffy rice or tomato glaze, sometimes both. They were quick to make, easy to serve, and somehow managed to feel special even on a weekday. The smell of roasting meat filled every corner of the kitchen, promising a dinner that was humble but full of heart. Each bite brought that familiar comfort of classic meatloaf but with a twist, a crispy edge from the tin and a tender center that melted under your fork. These little loaves were built for busy families who still wanted the taste of home-cooked care. They were neat, warm, and made with love, the kind of dinner that said everything without needing a word.
Corned beef and cabbage with cornbread dumplings was a dish that stretched one pot into a complete meal, requiring nothing else on the table. The corned beef simmered in seasoned broth with cabbage wedges until tender, then spoonfuls of cornbread batter were dropped directly into the bubbling liquid. The dumplings puffed up and cooked through, absorbing the rich broth while maintaining their cornmeal texture. Families ladled everything into deep bowls: meat, cabbage, dumplings, and plenty of broth. The dumplings turned soup into something more substantial, filling bellies that needed fuel for hard work. This was made when bread was running low or when something different was needed. It showed the ingenuity of cooks who understood that starch could come from many places, adding Southern character to an already beloved combination. Smothered corned beef and cabbage was the dish that proved even already tender meat could benefit from more time in the pot.
Church basement sloppy joes were the heart of community gatherings, the kind of meal that fed dozens and still tasted like something made with love. The recipe began with ground beef browned in a wide skillet, then mixed with onions cooked until soft and fragrant. Tomato sauce, vinegar, mustard, and brown sugar followed, each added with instinct learned over time. As the mixture simmered, it thickened into a sauce that clung to every crumbled piece of meat. In church basements and community halls, long tables waited for families to gather. Children lined up with paper plates, adults poured sweet tea, and the smell drifted through the room like a warm invitation. These sandwiches were messy, but no one cared. They symbolized generosity and the kind of cooking that made people feel welcome. Your grandparents stirred huge pots with wooden spoons nearly as old as the building itself. No one left hungry, and no one left feeling alone. Church basement sloppy joes fed more than bodies. They fed connection. Macaroni and beef bake was the original soul pasta, bubbling from ovens long before casseroles filled cookbooks. Elbow macaroni cooked tender and mixed with browned beef, tomato sauce, and sharp cheddar cheese became the weeknight hero of 1,000 kitchens. It was simple, warm, and deeply satisfying. Each spoonful balanced tangy tomato with rich, meaty flavor, wrapped in the creamy melt of cheese. Families would gather around the table, the dish still steaming, the first scoop breaking through the golden crust on top. It was the kind of food that smelled like home before it even hit the plate. You could dress it up with bell peppers and onion or keep it plain for the kids. It never disappointed. The best part was that it reheated perfectly, which meant leftovers were as good as the first night. It was comfort disguised as convenience, made for people who needed to stretch their meals and still make them special. This dish was more than dinner. It was proof that flavor and thrift could live side by side, one bubbling pan at a time.
Corned beef and cabbage with black-eyed peas was a fusion dish that married Irish-American tradition with African-American soul food staples. The corned beef was sliced thin and layered over simmered black-eyed peas cooked with onions, garlic, and ham hock for smokiness. Shredded cabbage was wilted in the potlikker from the peas, absorbing that earthy, savory flavor. The combination provided complete protein and stretched the meat further than it could go alone. Families served this, especially on New Year's Day when black-eyed peas symbolized luck. The salty corned beef played beautifully against the creamy peas and tender cabbage. It was a dish born of necessity and cultural blending that became beloved in its own right. This combination showed how African-American cooks transformed ingredients into something uniquely their own.
Country fried ground beef patties were the kind of meal your grandparents made when they wanted something crisp, comforting, and sturdy enough to hold up after a long day. Ground beef was shaped into patties, seasoned by hand, then dredged lightly in flour before hitting a hot skillet. The flour formed a thin crust that crackled at the edges, while the inside stayed tender and juicy. Once fried, the patties were served with rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, depending on what was available. Some families topped them with gravy, others ate them plain, but either way they were satisfying. Children loved the crispy edges, adults appreciated how far a little beef could go, and everyone enjoyed a meal that felt hearty without being complicated. This dish represented the practical side of home cooking: simple steps, simple ingredients, big comfort. Country fried ground beef patties were proof that older cooks knew how to turn the ordinary into something memorable. Hamburger gravy over rice was one of those dishes that tasted like comfort, no matter where you were. It showed up in school cafeterias, church kitchens, and home tables across the South, filling plates with warmth and simplicity. Ground beef was browned until it sizzled, mixed with flour and milk to make a creamy gravy that clung to every grain of rice. The smell was humble but unforgettable, buttery, savory, and familiar. It was not fancy food, just honest food, made to stretch a little meat into a full meal. Kids grew up on it, remembering the way the gravy soaked into the rice and turned it soft at the edges. You could find it on weeknights when money was tight, or Sundays when bellies were big and time was slow. It was filling, cheap, and full of love, the kind of dish that made people stop talking for a minute just to savor it. Every bite carried the quiet pride of making something good from what you had. Even now, few things feel as comforting as a plate of hamburger gravy over rice, a spoonful of home, served hot. Beef and rutabaga winter stew was the kind of cold weather meal that kept families warm long before central heating became common. Rutabagas lasted through winter storage, making them one of the most dependable vegetables older cooks had. When chopped and simmered with ground beef, onions, garlic, and simple seasoning, the stew became thick, earthy, and deeply satisfying. The rutabagas softened slowly, absorbing the flavor of the meat while adding their own gentle sweetness. Some families added carrots or potatoes. Others kept it simple, relying on the rutabagas to do most of the work. The pot simmered for hours, filling the house with a comforting aroma. Bowls of this stew were eaten slowly, giving warmth that lingered long after dinner ended. Meals like this were shaped by practicality, by knowledge passed through generations about how to survive harsh seasons with steady nourishment. Beef and rutabaga winter stew was survival wrapped in comfort.
Corned beef and fried cabbage with bacon was the dish that added smokiness and extra richness to an already satisfying combination. Bacon was rendered first in a cast iron skillet, then removed while the fat remained. Shredded cabbage was fried in that bacon grease until it wilted and picked up golden edges. Sliced corned beef was added to warm through, then crumbled. Bacon returned to the pan. Everything was tossed together and served immediately while still sizzling. The bacon added another layer of pork flavor that complemented the corned beef perfectly. This was not health food. It was soul food, meant to satisfy completely. Families served it as a main dish with cornbread or as a hearty side. The combination of two cured porks with sweet cabbage created something irresistible.
Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a meal your grandparents made when they needed color, warmth, and comfort all in one pot without spending much. It began with ground beef browning in a sturdy skillet, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the sweet peppers, sliced into strips that brightened both the pan and the mood. As they softened, their gentle sweetness blended into the savory beef. A pot of rice cooked quietly on the back burner, fluffy and ready to carry the meal. Once combined, each grain absorbed the seasoned juices and pepper flavor. Your grandparents seasoned it by feel, adding paprika, hot sauce, or broth depending on what the week allowed. Some versions added tomatoes, others kept things simple, but every variation carried the same warmth. Children scraped their plates clean because the dish was hearty without being heavy, and adults loved how far it stretched. Sweet pepper and beef smothered rice was a reminder that simple ingredients, handled with care, could make a supper feel complete. Turn on the stove. Stuffed bell peppers with rice and tomato sauce once turned humble ingredients into a dish that looked like celebration. Mothers would hollow out bright green peppers, stuff them with ground beef, rice, and onion, then pour tomato sauce over the top before baking them slow until tender. The smell that rose from the oven was pure comfort, savory, sweet, and familiar. This was dinner that took effort, the kind you started early in the day so it would be ready just in time for family to gather. The peppers softened, the sauce thickened, and the flavors blended into one of those meals that felt like home. They looked fancy but were made from what was on hand. Nothing wasted, everything earned. For many families, it was the taste of pride, proof that thrift could still look beautiful on a plate. Today, they have mostly disappeared from weeknight tables, replaced by quicker meals, but the memory of a bubbling pan of stuffed peppers still carries that same slow-cooked warmth. Southern macaroni and beef casserole was the kind of dinner your grandparents made when they wanted something baked and comforting, the sort of meal that smelled like relief after a long week. It started with ground beef browned with onions, garlic, and chili powder for warmth. Worcestershire sauce deepened the flavor, creating a savory base that wrapped around the macaroni once it was stirred in. Tomatoes, peas, or corn were added to stretch it further because feeding many required creativity. Everything went into a casserole dish and was topped with hand-grated cheese, which older cooks swore melted better than anything from a bag. As it baked, the cheese bubbled and browned into a crust everyone fought over. The sound of the dish hitting the table drew the household close because meals like this promised comfort. Your grandparents served it in large scoops, each bite hearty and familiar. Southern macaroni and beef casserole may be rare now, but in memory it remains a flavor of home.
Corned beef and cabbage with hominy was the combination that added chewy texture and corn flavor to the pot. Canned or dried hominy was simmered alongside the cabbage in the corned beef broth until heated through and infused with meaty flavor. The large, puffy corn kernels provided a different texture than potatoes, their slight chewiness contrasting with the tender meat and soft cabbage. Families who kept hominy in the pantry added it to soups and stews as a matter of course. The corn flavor complemented the salt of the corned beef while making the dish feel more southern. Children often picked out the hominy, enjoying its unique texture. This variation showed how pantry staples naturally found their way into whatever was cooking, creating new traditions from available ingredients.
Smothered hamburger steak with peppers was one of those grown folks' dinners that carried weight, warmth, and a kind of quiet pride. Beef patties were shaped thick and seasoned well, then browned in a skillet before being covered in a mixture of onions, peppers, and gravy. As everything simmered, the patties absorbed the flavors, turning tender enough to cut with a fork. The gravy thickened and clung to the meat, rich with the sweetness of the vegetables. This was the kind of dinner adults made after long days, meant to restore strength and calm tired minds. Served with rice or potatoes, smothered hamburger steak was steady, soulful food. It tasted like care you could feel in every bite. Quick meatball stew with vegetables was a one-pot wonder for busy families who still wanted food that felt whole. Ground beef was rolled into small, uneven balls, browned lightly, and dropped into a bubbling broth of carrots, celery, onions, and potatoes. The smell filled the kitchen long before supper began, carrying warmth through every room. It was a dish that balanced heartiness and care, built from what was already in the pantry. As the meatballs simmered, the broth thickened slightly, gathering flavor from every ingredient it touched. It was rich, humble, and endlessly adaptable. Some families added rice for body, others thickened it with flour or a scoop of mashed potatoes. Every spoonful held a mix of thrift and comfort, the taste of nourishment done right. It was dinner that arrived at the end of long days and reminded everyone that enough was often plenty. Quick meatball stew was a small triumph of resourcefulness, a meal that filled bellies, fed friends, and left nothing to waste.
Classic Sunday corned beef and cabbage was the centerpiece of countless African-American dinner tables during the 1970s, a dish that brought families together and filled homes with rich, savory aromas. The corned beef was simmered low and slow until tender enough to shred with a fork, while the cabbage softened in the meat's broth until it absorbed every drop of flavor. Families served it alongside cornbread or buttered potatoes, stretching the meal to feed everyone. The dish was both affordable and filling, making it practical for households on tight budgets. Children grew up expecting it every Sunday, while adults valued its reliability and warmth. It was not fancy, but it carried pride and comfort in every bite. Classic Sunday corned beef and cabbage was more than dinner. It was tradition, memory, and the taste of home. Corned beef hash with fried cabbage was Monday morning's answer to Sunday's leftovers, a dish that turned scraps into something families look forward to. The corned beef was chopped into small cubes and fried in a cast iron skillet with diced potatoes and onions until crispy edges formed, while shredded cabbage was added and cooked until caramelized.
Skillet hamburger hash with potatoes was the kind of meal your grandparents leaned on when the day had already taken every ounce of their energy, but the family still needed something warm and filling before bedtime. It always began with ground beef sizzling in a cast iron pan, releasing just enough fat to soften the onions that followed. Then came the diced potatoes, piled high at first, slowly sinking into the pan as the heat worked its way through them. Those potatoes were the real secret, stretching the meat further and soaking up every bit of seasoning until they tasted richer than they had any right to be. Your grandparents learned to flip the potatoes at just the right moment, leaving some edges crisp while letting the centers turn tender and soft. The smell alone brought kids drifting into the kitchen, hoping to snag a crispy piece before the spoon scraped it off the bottom. Sometimes a spoonful of broth was added, sometimes a splash of vinegar or a pinch of paprika, each variation shaped by whatever the pantry allowed that week. Nothing ever went to waste in meals like this. Every bite carried the feeling of care, of resourcefulness, of doing the best you could with what you had. A skillet like this made a house feel steady, even during the hardest years. And families remember those flavors long after the recipe faded from everyday cooking. It was simple food, but it carried a depth that came from generations learning how to make a little stretch a long way. Skillet hamburger hash was not just supper. It was a kind of quiet reassurance passed from one plate to the next. Creole beef and rice skillet was what you made when you needed to feed a family quick but wanted it to taste like home. Ground beef sizzled with bell pepper, celery, and onion, the holy trinity of Southern cooking. A little paprika, a pinch of cayenne, and suddenly the air smelled like Louisiana itself. This one-pan supper was the kind of dish that brought rhythm to a weekday, quick to make yet full of heart. The rice soaked up all that spice and tomato, turning a simple skillet into something rich and layered. You could hear the sizzle, see the color, and know dinner was done. It was a meal built for families that worked hard and came home hungry. Proof that you did not need a feast to make people smile. Creole beef and rice was everyday genius, a way to bring big flavor out of small means. Now it sits in old church cookbooks and memories, waiting for someone to give it another
Fried corned beef and cabbage patties were one of those clever creations that turned leftovers into something children actually asked for by name. Leftover corned beef was shredded fine and mixed with mashed potatoes, finely chopped cabbage, eggs, and seasoning until it held together in thick patties. These were dredged in flour and fried in bacon grease until golden brown and crispy on both sides while staying soft inside. The patties were served hot with mustard or hot sauce, creating a handheld meal perfect for lunch boxes or quick dinners. Mothers valued these patties because they used up every scrap while creating something new. The crispy exterior gave way to tender, flavorful filling with each bite. These patties proved that economical cooking could be just as delicious as anything bought fresh. Corned beef cabbage rolls were a Sunday specialty that required patience but delivered comfort worth every minute of preparation. Large cabbage leaves were blanched until pliable, then wrapped around a filling of shredded corned beef mixed with rice, onions, and seasonings. The rolls were nestled in a baking dish, covered with tomato sauce, and baked slowly until the cabbage became silky. The tomato sauce caramelized at the edges, adding sweetness that balanced the salty meat. These rolls appeared at church suppers and family dinners, where they were greeted with appreciation for the effort they represented. Children learned to make them by watching their mothers carefully wrap each roll. Corned beef cabbage rolls showed how one cut of meat could be transformed through care into something elegant.
Beef and onion pan gravy, spoon bread was a dish your grandparents made when they wanted something warm and soothing, a kind of comfort that sank into the bones after long days of work. Spoon bread itself was soft, almost like a cross between cornbread and custard, baked until the top set and the inside stayed tender enough to scoop with a spoon. But what made the meal unforgettable was the pan gravy poured over the top. Ground beef was browned with onions until everything turned rich and fragrant, then simmered with a bit of broth and thickened slowly into a silky gravy that carried deep, savory flavor. When spoon bread soaked in that gravy, it transformed into something far more comforting than its simple ingredients suggested. Families sat quietly as they ate, letting the warmth settle in. Children scraped the corners of their bowls, chasing the last spoonfuls. Meals like this were not about luxury. They were about solace, about making a small pot of ingredients feel like abundance. Beef and onion pan gravy spoon bread tasted like rest, like steadiness, like the kind of care only older generations truly mastered. Okra and ground beef stew was a dish straight from southern soil and spirit. The okra came from the garden, tender and green, sliced thin and cooked slow with tomato, onion, and just enough ground beef to add richness. Everything melted together into something earthy, thick, and soulful. The broth took on the flavor of the meat, while the okra gave it that familiar southern texture, smooth, silky, and full of depth. It was a meal meant for long evenings, eaten with rice or cornbread that soaked up every drop. You could find it bubbling on stovetops in rural towns and city kitchens alike, passed down through hands that knew how to make something out of almost nothing. It was food born from rhythm and patience, a pot of memories that cooked as long as stories were told beside it. Even now, one bite can bring you back to that porch light glow and the hum of summer outside. Molasses milk drink was a common way to stretch both sweeteners and dairy during times of hardship. Hot milk, often reconstituted from powdered milk, was whisked with a spoonful of molasses until warm and smooth. The result was a drink that children could have before school or adults could sip before long workdays. It carried natural sweetness and important nutrients from molasses, while offering comfort when sugar was too costly to use. Families appreciated it because it was affordable, easy to prepare, and nourishing. Many children who grew up during lean times remembered this drink as both a treat and a necessity, even if they preferred chocolate or sugar when they could get it. The molasses milk drink proved that small substitutions could keep sweetness alive in daily life without breaking ration limits. It was simple, practical, and tied directly to the struggles of everyday survival, becoming a quiet but important memory of perseverance. Wild rice pudding combined indigenous grains with African-inspired preparation to create a dish both nourishing and subtly sweet. Wild rice grew naturally in shallow lakes and slow rivers, and enslaved families near these wetlands harvested the dark grains with paddles and baskets, drying them in the sun for year-round use. Cooked slowly in water until tender, the rice was stirred with a bit of sorghum syrup or honey if available, making a warm pudding that supplied protein and lasting energy. Its nutty flavor and satisfying texture turned a simple bowl into a special treat, especially when fresh fruit or spices could be added. This recipe carried forward after emancipation as African American cooks continued to value wild rice for festive meals and family gatherings. Modern chefs still celebrate its earthy richness, but the story behind wild rice pudding honors the blend of native and African foodways that sustained people through scarcity and created a dessert that is at once humble and deeply rooted in the shared history of America's wetlands and kitchens. Okra gumbo with fresh crab told the story of low-country waters and West African roots in every bowl. Thickened by the natural mucilage of okra and deepened with a slow-simmered stock, the stew held blue crab, onions, bell peppers, and fragrant spices that reflected both coastal bounty and ancestral memory. Fishermen brought the catch of the day to markets where cooks bargained for the sweetest crab meat, while home gardeners plucked tender okra pods from vines that thrived in humid summers. The gumbo pot became a gathering place where family and neighbors stood around sharing stories as the aroma of seafood and spice filled the air. Served over rice, each spoonful carried the taste of tides, soil, and a heritage that stretched back across the Atlantic. In modern times, many turned to faster recipes and frozen ingredients, losing the patient layering of flavor that once defined this dish. Yet for those who remember, nothing matches the soulful depth of a true okra gumbo made with freshly caught crab. Ham bone soup with vegetables was one of those meals where one piece of meat flavored an entire pot. A single ham bone, stripped of most of its meat, simmered for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and smoky. My grandmother would add beans or greens if she had them, letting the flavors meld into something far more substantial than the ingredients suggested. Families gathered around steaming bowls, dipping bread into the broth and savoring the flavor the bone had left behind. It was frugal cooking at its finest, taking scraps and stretching them into nourishment. The soup fed many mouths, warmed cold nights, and made do with what was available. In the 1960s, when meat was costly, a ham bone could be the centerpiece of dinner, proving that thrift and patience could coax flavor out of nearly anything. Ham bone soup with vegetables carried both practicality and comfort in every ladleful.
Corned beef and cabbage with turnips was the root vegetable variation that added earthiness and stretched the meal further. Turnips were peeled and cubed, then simmered in the broth alongside potatoes and cabbage until fork tender. Their slightly bitter, peppery flavor balanced the salt of the meat and the sweetness of the cooked cabbage. Families who grew turnips valued them for their storage ability and nutritional content. The root vegetables absorbed the meaty broth, becoming deeply flavored and satisfying. Children sometimes needed convincing, but the turnips cooked this way were far more appealing than when served alone. This variation showed how cooks used whatever grew in the garden to extend meals without sacrificing flavor. Turnips added the character and substance to an already beloved dish.
Beef and butter bean supper stew was the kind of meal your grandparents made when they needed something hearty enough to last into the next day. It started with browning the beef until it flavored the onions and celery that followed. Butter beans came next, adding a creaminess without needing milk or cream that many families could not spare. Broth, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables needed using went into the pot because nothing was wasted. As it simmered, the beans thickened the broth, turning it into a stew that clung to the spoon. Children dipped bread into their bowls. Adults ate quietly after long days, and everyone felt restored by its warmth. Your grandparents relied on meals like this because they were dependable and adaptable, fitting whatever the week allowed. Over time, the stew became tied to winter nights and small joys shared around the table. Beef and butter bean supper stew was not flashy, but it carried the quiet strength of those who made it. Hamburger corn chowder was creamy comfort that warmed both hands and hearts. It began with ground beef sizzling in a pot, filling the kitchen with the scent of something good on its way. Diced onions, potatoes, and sweet corn joined next, mingling in a mix of milk or cream until the broth thickened into something smooth and rich. The first spoonful was like a memory you could taste. Sweet corn crunch meeting the tender give of potato, all wrapped in savory warmth. This chowder stretched a little beef a long way, feeding big families with small means. It was a weeknight favorite on cold evenings when the wind rattled the windows and dinner had to feel like a hug. Some cooks sprinkled cheese on top, others stirred in paprika or thyme, but the spirit of the dish never changed. It was practical and kind, made from what was on hand and offered with care. One bowl could soften the hardest day, proof that comfort did not have to cost much. The pot sat on the stove long after supper, its warmth filling the air like quiet reassurance. Pig ear sandwiches were another example of how Black families wasted nothing and found flavor where others saw scraps. Pig ears, which butchers often sold cheaply, were boiled until tender, then sliced thin and placed between bread with mustard or hot sauce. The texture was chewy, but the taste was rich and savory, making them surprisingly satisfying. For many, these sandwiches became a dependable lunch or supper when more expensive meats were out of reach. They were especially common in rural towns where hogs were butchered at home and every part of the animal was used. Families knew that wasting nothing was not just thrifty, it was survival. Eating pig ears was also a mark of resilience, turning overlooked cuts into a food that people grew to enjoy. Today, pig ear sandwiches are remembered as a dish born from necessity, but filled with pride, showing just how much strength could be found in the humblest of meals. Hickory nut milk delivered rich nutrition from the forests when dairy was limited or unavailable. Hickory nuts were cracked and pounded into a fragrant paste, then steeped in hot water and strained to produce a creamy liquid full of natural oils and protein. This drink could be enjoyed warm as a morning beverage or used to enrich cornbread and porridges, offering sustenance without reliance on cow's milk. The technique drew directly from indigenous American practices, which African cooks learned and adapted to their own needs. Hickory trees were plentiful across the Southeast, ensuring a steady supply for those willing to gather and crack the tough shells. Even after emancipation, rural families continued making hickory milk for special dishes, and some Appalachian recipes still call for it today. Its smooth flavor and nourishing qualities illustrate how African American cooks combined local knowledge and Old World methods to create foods of lasting value. Hickory nut milk stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of ingenuity, linking the forest's bounty to a tradition of resilience and culinary skill. Collard green Potlikker soup captured the very essence of slow cooking and careful stewardship. After hours of simmering collard greens with smoked meat, the broth left in the pot was a mineral-rich elixir, treasured as much as the greens themselves. Families poured this flavorful liquid into bowls and sipped it with pieces of cornbread, believing it to restore strength and spirit after long days of work. Some added hot pepper vinegar for a lively kick, while others preferred it plain and soothing. Children learned early never to throw away the potlikker, understanding that its nutrients were too valuable to waste. Neighbors often shared jars with the sick or elderly, turning the simple broth into a gesture of care and healing. Modern kitchens may overlook this tradition, discarding the liquid without thought, but for those who remember, the taste of potlikker carries the memory of community generosity and the wisdom of using every drop the garden and the kitchen could provide.
Corned beef and cabbage sandwiches were the lunch counter staple that turned dinner leftovers into handheld perfection. Thick slices of corned beef were piled high on rye bread with soft braised cabbage and a generous smear of mustard. Some families added Swiss cheese and grilled the whole thing until the bread crisped and cheese melted. The sandwiches were hearty enough to fuel a full day's work and portable enough for lunch pails carried to factories. Children begged for them in their school lunches, proud to unwrap something so substantial. The combination of tender meat, sweet cabbage, and tangy mustard created perfect balance in every bite. These sandwiches proved that leftovers could become something entirely new, something worth looking forward to rather than just finishing up.
Ground beef succotash supper was a bowl of comfort shaped by rural southeastern foodways, where corn and lima beans were always close at hand and ground beef made the whole dish feel like a complete meal. The beef was browned first, then mixed with onions, peppers, and garlic before the vegetables were stirred in. Corn added sweetness, lima beans added earthiness, and together they created a balance older cooks cherished. Everything simmered in one pot, allowing the flavors to mingle into something simple but satisfying. This was the kind of dish that fed large families without much cost, relying on pantry staples and whatever seasonings were available. Grandparents served it with cornbread or rice, both of which stretched the meal even further. Succotash supper was humble, steady food, built to nourish and keep people going. It carried the taste of long summers, family gardens, and the resourcefulness that defined generations. Beefy spaghetti with seasoned tomato paste was the pantry hero long before store-bought sauces became a household staple. Ground beef browned in a skillet with onion and garlic, then mixed with a small can of tomato paste stretched by water or broth, transforming into a rich sauce that clung to the pan and deepened with every stir. Salt, pepper, and a handful of dried herbs gave it soul, filling the kitchen with a scent that promised comfort. It was quick, hearty, and satisfying, the kind of meal that brought everyone to the table fast. Families made it on lean weeks when creativity had to do the work of plenty. The result was tangy, savory, and thick, a sauce born from thrift but rich in taste. Kids twirled it on forks, never realizing how far 1 pound of beef could be stretched. Some called it poor man's pasta, but there was nothing poor about how it felt. The red sauce, bubbling low and steady, seemed to hold generations of care. Even today, that smell of tomato and beef simmering together feels like home itself, a reminder that the simplest meals often last the longest in memory.
Corned beef and cabbage stuffed peppers were the colorful dish that turned leftovers into something that looked planned and intentional. Bell peppers were hollowed out and filled with a mixture of chopped corned beef, shredded cabbage, rice, and tomato sauce, then baked until the peppers softened. The peppers provided natural containers that made portioning easy and presentation attractive. Each person got their own stuffed pepper complete with all the flavors of corned beef and cabbage. Families made these when they wanted something different from the usual preparations. The tomato sauce added brightness that complemented the salty meat. Children often ate these more willingly than loose cabbage on a plate. Stuffed peppers showed that familiar flavors could be presented in new ways that excited rather than bored.
Cornbread-topped beef pie was the kind of dish that made an ordinary evening feel special, even when the ingredients were humble. Your grandparents started by browning the ground beef with onions and garlic until the mixture turned savory and fragrant. Vegetables followed, often whatever could be found in the pantry or pulled from the garden. The filling simmered into a warm, hearty base that could have stood on its own. But the cornbread batter poured over the top transformed it, baking into a golden crust that was tender on the bottom and crisp on the surface. The smell filled the house with a sense of abundance, even in hard times. Your grandparents cut generous squares, each serving carrying the perfect blend of sweet cornbread and savory beef. Cornbread-topped beef pie proved that simple ingredients, handled with care, could feel like a celebration. Sweet pepper and onion beef sandwiches were born from markets and lunch counters, where the smell of sizzling meat drew crowds. Ground beef cooked down with sliced onions and bell peppers until soft and caramelized, seasoned with salt, garlic, and a splash of vinegar for brightness. The mixture was spooned onto soft sandwich buns, steam rising through the paper wrapper. It was messy, juicy, and perfect with mustard or hot sauce. Workers ate them during short breaks. Families made them on busy nights. They were fast, flavorful, and cheap. The sweetness of the peppers cut through the savory beef, making each bite balanced and satisfying. It was the kind of sandwich that felt bigger than its ingredients, a little feast held in your hands. You could find them at fairs, church picnics, or just sizzling on a home griddle. Like many good things, they faded as time sped up, but one bite could still bring back that slow, happy rhythm of a simpler day. Boiled peanuts may sound like a simple snack, but they carried deep meaning during times when money was short. Fresh green peanuts were harvested from fields and boiled slowly in salted water until soft, turning them into something filling and protein-rich. They were sold by street vendors, shared at church gatherings, and eaten hot from pots on family stoves. The salty, earthy flavor made them addictive, and because peanuts were relatively inexpensive, they became a food that was both affordable and sustaining. For many Black families, boiled peanuts represented community and togetherness as much as they did thrift. They were eaten by hand, cracked open while people talked, sang, or worked, making them a food tied closely to everyday life. In hard times, they were cheap enough to feel like a small luxury, a treat that was still practical. Boiled peanuts became more than food. They were a shared memory, passed down across generations.
Sliced corned beef was layered with cabbage in a Dutch oven, covered with gravy made from the cooking liquid thickened with flour and enriched with butter. The pot was covered tightly and cooked low until the cabbage became silky and the gravy reduced to a glossy coating. The smothering technique came straight from Southern cooking tradition, transforming a simple combination into something deeply comforting. Families served it over rice or with biscuits to catch every drop. The dish required patience, but rewarded it with flavors that melded completely together. Smothered corned beef and cabbage was Sunday cooking at its finest, unhurried, intentional, and utterly satisfying. Corned beef and cabbage with sweet potatoes was a combination that brought natural sweetness to balance the salt of the meat. Chunks of sweet potato were added to the pot during the last hour of cooking, absorbing the briny broth while maintaining their structure. The cabbage and sweet potatoes cooked together, their sugars caramelizing slightly. Families served everything in shallow bowls, ensuring each portion had meat, cabbage, and orange fleshed potato. The combination was popular in Southern households where sweet potatoes were garden staples. Children who might refuse plain cabbage ate it happily when sweet potato was involved. This variation showed how African American cooks adapted recipes to include affordable ingredients. Sweet potatoes turned corned beef and cabbage into something that felt native to the South.
Beefy mustard green skillet was the kind of dish grandparents made on nights when they needed something hearty, but did not have the time or the ingredients for a long stew. Mustard greens grew fast, grew plentiful, and brought a bold, peppery flavor that could make even a small amount of beef feel like a feast. Ground beef was cooked first, releasing enough fat to soften the onions and garlic before the greens were piled into the pan. As the greens wilted, they soaked in the beef juices, turning tender and savory with just enough bite to remind everyone where the flavor came from. Some families added vinegar, others added hot sauce, and many added crushed red pepper for a slow warmth that spread through the whole dish. Children who might have avoided greens on their own ate them without question when they carried the richness of beef. This skillet was simple fuel, built from ingredients that kept families full during long seasons of work. Meals like this were proof that older generations understood how to stretch flavor and nourishment with experience rather than expense. Beefy mustard green skillet was not fancy, but it fed people with honesty and strength. Smothered hamburger steaks with onions and gravy were the kind of meal that stretched $1 and still made Sunday feel special. Families took plain ground beef, shaped it into thick patties, and fried them until the edges browned. Then came the magic: sliced onions, browned in the same pan until soft and golden, stirred into a homemade gravy rich with flavor and patience. The smell alone could fill a kitchen with warmth and promise. You did not need expensive cuts of meat when you could make this. Every forkful soaked in that brown onion gravy was comfort itself, spooned over rice or mashed potatoes that soaked up every drop. Kids would ask for seconds, even if the portions were small. It was food that carried care, slow simmered on the stove while conversation drifted through the house. Smothered hamburger steaks turned scarcity into something soulful, a dish that said you did not need much to eat well. They disappeared from tables as fast food took over, but their memory lingers in every home where love was ladled from a pan. Chicken neck gravy was the very definition of stretching scraps into a full meal. Poultry was expensive and few families could afford large cuts, so nothing from a chicken ever went to waste. Necks were simmered slowly to release every bit of flavor, then thickened into a gravy with flour and drippings. Poured over rice, mashed potatoes, or biscuits, it transformed the cheapest part of the bird into something filling and comforting. Families looked forward to it because it stretched one bird into several meals, ensuring nothing was thrown away. This kind of resourcefulness defined survival cooking, and for many Black families in the South, it was routine. Chicken neck gravy might not have been glamorous, but it represented pride in making the most out of very little. It also carried the feeling of home, the scent of gravy simmering on the stove, and the relief of knowing everyone at the table would leave fed. Smoked catfish tails reveal the skill and resourcefulness that defined survival cooking on plantations near rivers and coastal waters. After commercial fishermen or estate kitchens took the prime fillets, the bony tails and smaller pieces were often left behind. Enslaved cooks cleaned these scraps carefully, rubbed them with salt or local spices, and smoked them over slow hickory fires. The result was a flavorful preserved fish that kept for days and could be stirred into stews, crumbled over grains, or eaten on its own with cornbread. Smoking techniques reflected West African traditions carried across the Atlantic, where preserving fish with wood smoke had long been a way to ensure protein during lean seasons. In later years, African American fish camps and southern smokehouses continued this method, turning a food of necessity into a celebrated regional specialty. Modern smoked catfish dishes found in Mississippi and Louisiana restaurants still trace their flavor back to these early practices of careful preservation and culinary creativity born from scarcity.
The combination created a symphony of textures: crispy meat, tender potatoes, and sweet cabbage mingling together. Topped with a fried egg, its runny yolk became natural gravy. This dish was about making the most of what remained. Families understood that wasting food was unacceptable, and this hash proved that creativity could transform leftovers into a meal worth remembering. The smell of it frying filled kitchens with warmth. Corned beef and cabbage soup was the kind of dish that stretched a little into a lot, feeding large families on cold winter evenings when warmth mattered as much as flavor. The broth was built from bones and trimmings of corned beef, simmered for hours with bay leaves, peppercorns, and onion until it developed rich depth. Chunks of tender corned beef joined wedges of cabbage, carrots, and potatoes, creating a soup hearty enough to serve as a complete meal. Families ladled it into deep bowls and served it with thick slices of cornbread for soaking up every drop. The soup could be reheated for days, improving each time. It represented the wisdom of making one piece of meat feed a family for an entire week, stretching resources without sacrificing satisfaction.
Tomato gravy over ground beef patties was one of those Sunday lunches that made the whole house feel slower and softer. The kind of meal your grandparents prepared with a kind of patience that came from feeding families long before convenience foods existed. The patties were shaped by hand, seasoned by instinct, and browned just enough to build a deep flavor before they simmered in a pot of tomato gravy. That gravy was never rushed. It started with onions cooked until sweet, then tomatoes cooked down until they softened into something thick and comforting. A pinch of sugar balanced the acidity, a splash of vinegar sharpened it, and everything else depended on the cook's mood and memory. As the patties simmered, they soaked up the gravy, becoming tender enough to cut with the side of a fork. Children would mop their plates with cornbread or biscuits, not wanting to waste a single streak of sauce. Meals like this were more than food. They were tradition, a reminder of Sundays spent together after long weeks where everyone carried more than they let on. Tomato gravy over ground beef patties tasted like comfort shaped by hands that knew exactly what families needed. Ground beef and turnip greens turned two humble ingredients into a powerhouse of nourishment and pride. Southern cooks knew how to make this dish sing with nothing more than heat, patience, and instinct. The greens were chopped and sautéed in a skillet with onions, garlic, and just enough bacon drippings or lard to coat them. Once softened, the browned ground beef joined the pan, and everything simmered together until the flavors became one. The aroma was rich and earthy, smoky from the fat and fresh from the greens, the kind of smell that drew family to the kitchen without a word. Served with hot sauce and a square of cornbread, it was simple food that could fill both the belly and the spirit. It was never meant to be fancy. It was survival turned delicious. Each bite carried the wisdom of thrift, the balance of strength and subtlety that Southern kitchens mastered long ago. It stretched a small amount of meat into a meal for many, and no one ever left hungry. This dish stood for more than taste. It was a quiet act of care, of making enough out of almost nothing. Ground beef and turnip greens proved that flavor, like love, often came from the humblest places. Hog maw stew was a dish that took something most would discard and transformed it into a centerpiece for the table. Hog maw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was cleaned carefully, then stuffed with potatoes, onions, and spices before being simmered until tender. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply flavorful, stretching small amounts of ingredients into a meal that could feed an entire family. In times when money was scarce, hog maw stew allowed families to make use of what they had, proving that nothing from the animal went to waste. It was often served at gatherings where one pot had to go far, reminding everyone of the value of sharing and stretching food. The dish carried cultural roots tied to both survival and celebration, a reminder that even hard times could produce food that comforted and united. Hog maw stew was not fancy, but it represented ingenuity, thrift, and strength in the face of want. Cane top syrup began with the earliest shoots of sugarcane, long before the full harvest. When planters reserved the mature stalks for commercial sugar, enslaved workers cut the tender tops and simmered them slowly, extracting a thin but sweet syrup. This homemade sweetener flavored cornbread, porridge, and hot drinks, adding a rare touch of luxury to daily meals. The technique reflected both African experience with cane and Caribbean methods of small-batch syrup making. After emancipation, many rural families continued to boil cane juice into syrup during the early season, a practice still alive in parts of Louisiana and Florida. The flavor is lighter and grassier than late-season molasses, making it unique among southern sweeteners. Cane-top syrup shows how skilled hands transformed what might have been discarded into something valuable, blending cultural knowledge with the natural rhythms of the crop. It stands as a reminder that, even in conditions of deprivation, African-American cooks created enduring regional flavors that remain treasured in southern pantries today.
Corned beef and cabbage stew was the kind of one-pot meal that simmered all afternoon, filling the house with anticipation. Chunks of corned beef were browned first for extra flavor, then covered with water and simmered with cabbage wedges, potatoes, carrots, and onions until fork tender. The broth thickened naturally from the starches in the potatoes, creating gravy that clung to every piece. Families served it in deep bowls with plenty of bread for soaking. The stew was especially popular during winter months when something warm and substantial was needed to fight the cold. It could feed a crowd and tasted even better the second day when the flavors had deepened overnight. Corned beef and cabbage stew was honest food, unpretentious but deeply satisfying and always welcome. Corned beef and cabbage with potlikker was a dish that honored the Southern tradition of saving every drop of cooking liquid. After the corned beef was boiled tender, the remaining broth, rich with meat juices, salt, and fat, became precious potlikker, never discarded. Cabbage was simmered directly in this liquid until it absorbed the meaty essence, turning soft and deeply flavored. Families served the cabbage in shallow bowls with the potlikker spooned over top, accompanied by cornbread for dunking. The liquid itself was considered nourishing, often given to children for strength. This practice reflected deep understanding that nutrition existed in every part of the cooking process. Saving and using potlikker was not just frugal, it was wise. The dish carried generations of knowledge.
Okra tomato beef hot pot was the kind of layered dish your grandparents made when they needed something filling enough to last through the next day, but simple enough to assemble without fuss. The pot always began with browned beef seasoned with onions and garlic. Then came layers of fresh okra, ripe tomatoes, and sometimes potatoes or corn. Each layer brought its own texture and its own depth of flavor. As the pot simmered, the okra softened and thickened the broth naturally, blending with the tomatoes to create a sauce that clung to every bite. Families often ate it with cornbread, letting the bread soak in the juices until it tasted like a meal on its own. Dishes like this came from a tradition of practicality, of making the most of whatever the garden or pantry offered. The hot pot fed many, reheated well, and carried the warmth of southern kitchens shaped by generations. Okra tomato beef hot pot was food for long days, long weeks, and long memories. Stuffed cabbage rolls in tomato sauce were a southern love letter to an old European idea. Tender cabbage leaves were blanched just enough to fold, then filled with a mix of ground beef, rice, and onion seasoned with salt and pepper. The rolls were packed tight in a pot, covered with sweet tomato sauce, and simmered low until everything melted together. The cabbage softened to silk while the beef turned tender and juicy inside. The sauce thickened into something tangy and rich, coating every bite like a memory. It was food made slow, food that took patience and care. For many families, it was Sunday dinner, a dish that reminded them of where they came from and how far they had come. The recipe moved from immigrant tables to southern kitchens, gathering new flavors along the way. Served with cornbread or mashed potatoes, it filled bellies and hearts in equal measure. Though few take the time to make it now, its spirit lives on in every simmering pot of homemade comfort. Molasses glazed meat roll was a home-style favorite that brought sweetness and comfort to the dinner table long before convenience sauces existed. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then shaped into a firm roll that baked slowly in the oven. What made it special was the glaze, a simple mixture brushed over the top that baked into a dark, shiny coating. Molasses added depth and sweetness, turning every slice into a blend of savory and rich flavor that felt both hearty and nostalgic. As the meat roll baked, the glaze caramelized, filling the house with a warm smell older generations never forgot. This dish was often served with potatoes, greens, or simple vegetables, making it a complete meal without much expense. It was the kind of recipe passed quietly between families, a reminder of times when simple ingredients created the most memorable meals. Molasses glazed meat roll may be rare today, but it remains a treasured piece of older kitchen wisdom. Cajun ground beef jambalaya was the weeknight miracle that never failed to please. Instead of sausage or chicken, ground beef stood in proudly, making the dish quicker and cheaper without losing its fire. The flavor began with the Holy Trinity: onion, celery, and bell pepper, sautéed in oil until soft, fragrant, and golden. Rice joined the mix, turning translucent before tomato, broth, and spice were stirred in. Paprika deepened the color, cayenne brought heat, and thyme gave soul. As it simmered, the aroma filled the house with the promise of something special. The rice turned red gold, every grain coated in flavor, every bite smoky and warm. This was not restaurant food. It was life food, fast but full of love. Families ate it loud, laughing between spoonfuls, passing bottles of hot sauce across the table. It was hearty enough for winter, bright enough for summer, and always welcome. Cajun ground beef jambalaya was proof that joy could be cooked in one pot, fed to many, and never forgotten.
Corned beef and cabbage with hot pepper vinegar was the condiment pairing that added brightness and heat to every bite. Hot pepper vinegar, made by steeping hot peppers in white vinegar for weeks, was drizzled over the finished dish at the table. The acid cut through the richness of the meat, while the heat provided a slow burn that built with each forkful. Bottles of hot pepper vinegar sat on tables throughout the South as essential as salt and pepper. Families passed them around, each person adding as much or as little as they preferred. The vinegar also helped preserve appetite, making food taste fresh and vibrant even as leftovers. This pairing showed how simple condiments could transform familiar dishes into something exciting. Hot pepper vinegar turned corned beef and cabbage into something that woke up the palate.
Creole ground beef and rice bake was the sort of meal your grandparents turned to when they wanted something bold, comforting, and steady enough to feed a full table without spending much at all. It always started with ground beef in a deep pan, blended with onions, celery, and green bell pepper, the holy trinity that shaped countless Southern and Gulf Coast suppers. As the vegetables softened, they melted into the meat, releasing a fragrance that wrapped through the kitchen like memory. Tomatoes, garlic, and a touch of hot sauce followed, giving the dish its quiet heat. The rice was cooked separately, then folded in so it could absorb the seasoned juices before everything baked together. Families loved this meal because it fed many and filled the house with a smell that made the day feel easier. Your grandparents seasoned it by instinct, adding a pinch more spice or a splash more sauce depending on who was coming to dinner. Creole ground beef and rice bake was comfort built from tradition and adapted through necessity, a dish that fed both body and memory. Ground beef and cornbread casserole was a Southern invention that understood flavor like few others did. Spicy ground beef went into the bottom of a baking dish, seasoned with onion, chili, and tomato, while a golden cornbread batter was poured on top and baked until puffed and crusted at the edges. When it came out, the smell of corn and spice filled the house. The first spoonful revealed layers, the sweetness of the bread meeting the tangy beef below. It was a meal that cost little but felt abundant, something that could feed a crowd without complaint. The dish was both hearty and clever, turning pantry staples into a centerpiece. It brought together the best of African American cooking: thrift, creativity and balance between bold spice and gentle sweetness. These casseroles warmed families on cold evenings and left no one hungry. Today, they are a memory of flavor born from necessity, proof that simple food, made right, could hold the heart of a whole generation.
Corned beef with creamed cabbage was a dish that brought richness to an otherwise straightforward combination, creating something that felt almost luxurious. The cabbage was shredded and cooked slowly in a mixture of butter, flour, and milk until silky and tender, bathed in velvety cream sauce. Sliced corned beef was arranged on plates with generous spoonfuls of the creamed cabbage alongside. The cream sauce mellowed the cabbage's sharpness, while the salty meat provided contrast. This preparation appeared at Sunday dinners when something refined was called for. It showed that simple ingredients could be elevated through technique without adding expense. Children who normally refused plain cabbage cleaned their plates when served this way. Corned beef with creamed cabbage was comfort food dressed up for company.
Beef and sweet onion baked rice was the kind of oven dish your grandparents made when they wanted something that tasted slow-cooked, but required only a bit of preparation. Ground beef was browned with thick slices of sweet onions until the onions softened and released their natural sugars. Rice was added with broth, then everything baked until the grains absorbed every drop of flavor. As it cooked, the onions caramelized deeper, turning the entire dish fragrant and comforting. The top developed a gentle crust, while the inside stayed tender and rich. Families loved meals like this because they were dependable, filling, and easy to serve. Beef and sweet onion baked rice tasted like home, warm, steady, and made with care. Savory bread pudding with ground beef was a dish born from thrift and imagination, the kind that turned scarcity into satisfaction. No crumb went to waste. Every stale loaf or half-eaten slice became the base for something extraordinary. The bread was torn into pieces, soaked in milk and beaten eggs, then mixed with sautéed onions, leftover gravy, and browned ground beef. Baked slowly until golden at the edges and soft in the center, it filled the house with a smell that felt like home. The crust cracked gently when you pressed a spoon into it, revealing a creamy, savory heart beneath. Each bite offered something familiar: bread that tasted like comfort, beef that grounded it, and spice that brought it to life. It was a full meal made from what others might have thrown away, a testament to both survival and skill. Families would eat it hot from the oven, sometimes with collard greens or beans on the side, grateful for food that stretched far and wasted nothing. In its warmth and simplicity, this bread pudding carried generations of quiet ingenuity, a reminder that care and resourcefulness could make even the smallest meal feel like abundance. Beef and sweet potato skillet mix was a dish shaped by resourcefulness, combining the savory richness of beef with the natural sweetness of sweet potatoes. The skillet began with browning the meat, then adding onions and peppers before the chunks of sweet potato went in. As everything cooked together, the sweet potatoes softened and caramelized, adding warmth and balance to the beef. Some grandparents added spices like paprika or cinnamon, blending savory and sweet in a way that felt both comforting and familiar. The dish stretched easily, feeding many without requiring much. It was the kind of meal that made use of what the land offered, honoring the resourcefulness of earlier generations. Beef and sweet potato skillet mix tasted like ingenuity and home.
Corned beef and cabbage with collard. Greens was the dish that doubled down on leafy vegetables, creating a pot rich with Southern tradition. Collard greens were added to the cooking liquid alongside the cabbage, their sturdy leaves standing up to the long simmer. The collards absorbed the salty, meaty broth and became silky while maintaining their distinct flavor. Families who always had collards in the garden naturally added them to stretch the meal further. The combination of two greens with corned beef was especially nourishing and filling. Potlikker from this version was dark and rich, packed with vitamins. This variation showed how Southern traditions naturally merged with other culinary influences to create something familiar and new. Collards made the dish feel completely at home in the South.
Ground beef and cabbage skillet was a meal your grandparents depended on when they needed to stretch a little meat across many plates. It started with browning the beef until it released enough flavor to soften the onions and garlic. Then came the cabbage, shredded into ribbons that always cooked down into something tender and sweet. As it wilted, it mingled with the beef juices, creating a broth that needed no fancy seasoning to taste full. Some families added vinegar for brightness, others stirred in tomatoes for depth, and many added rice or noodles when they needed the meal to go further. The dish simmered until everything melded together, turning into a comforting supper that filled plates without emptying pockets. Meals like this kept families steady through decades of hardship, proving that hearty food did not require wealth, only patience and a sure hand at the stove. Ground beef and cabbage skillet was survival and comfort woven into one dish. Sloppy Joe mix from scratch was what came before cans and shortcuts. The sauce started with tomato paste, vinegar, sugar, and a dash of mustard, all whisked together over heat until it thickened just enough to cling to the beef. When that mixture hit the skillet, it sizzled, and the air filled with the smell of tangy sweetness that drew everyone to the table. Served on soft white buns, these sandwiches were messy, simple, and perfect. They were made for gatherings, for kids laughing around kitchen tables, for hands too busy eating to worry about stains. The homemade version had a freshness that canned ones never could, a balance of flavor that came from instinct, not a label. It was one of those recipes that made a small home feel full. Before convenience became the norm, this was the flavor of care, real cooking in every sense. One pan, a few ingredients, and the kind of satisfaction only homemade food can bring.
Corned beef and cabbage with mustard greens was the variation that added bitter complexity to the familiar combination. Mustard greens were cooked down in corned beef broth alongside the cabbage, their sharp bite mellowing but never disappearing. The bitterness balanced the salt of the meat and the sweetness of braised cabbage, creating a more sophisticated flavor profile. Families who grew mustard greens added them naturally to whatever was cooking. The combination provided extra nutrition and made the pot stretch further. Potlikker from this version was especially prized, carrying the minerals and vitamins from the greens. This variation showed how African American cooks incorporated what grew readily into whatever they were making. Mustard greens added character and nutrition to an already beloved dish.
Picnic hand pies with ground beef filling were made for travel, work, and long afternoons outside. Dough was rolled thin, stuffed with a spiced beef mixture, then folded and sealed before baking or frying until golden brown. The result was a flaky crust with a juicy, flavorful center, portable comfort that fit right in your hand. You could eat them hot or cold, and they always tasted like home. The filling was simple: ground beef, onion, pepper, and a touch of spice, but the balance was perfect. These pies were wrapped in wax paper and packed in lunch pails, or carried to family picnics under the shade of trees. They were sturdy enough to last the day, but tender enough to feel like something special. Every bite was a mix of crisp pastry and seasoned meat, the kind of flavor that sticks in memory. It was the working person's meal turned treat, proof that love could be wrapped in dough and fried golden.
Corned beef and cabbage egg rolls were the inventive creation that wrapped familiar flavors in crispy shells. Shredded corned beef and finely chopped cabbage were seasoned and rolled tightly in egg roll wrappers, then fried until golden and crackling. The exterior shattered with each bite, giving way to the savory filling inside. These appeared at parties where finger food was needed, offering something unexpected that still tasted like home. Families made them when they wanted to impress guests or give children something fun to eat. The dipping sauce varied. Some used mustard, others hot sauce or sweet chili. Egg rolls showed how African American cooks adapted techniques from other cuisines while keeping flavors rooted in tradition. They proved that familiar ingredients could take entirely new forms.
Red pea and ground beef stew was a dish your grandparents cooked when they needed something hearty enough to feed many but gentle enough to simmer without constant attention. Red field peas softened beautifully in a slow-cooked pot, absorbing the juices from the ground beef until they turned almost creamy. Onions, peppers, and tomatoes added depth, while simple spices gave the stew its warmth. Some households added rice toward the end, others served the stew as it was, letting the peas carry the heart of the dish. The pot simmered quietly, thickening slowly, building flavor hour by hour. Families ladled it into bowls with gratitude, knowing it would last through the next day if needed. This stew represented a time when meals were built from what the land or pantry offered. Red pea and ground beef stew carried the taste of tradition, shaped by hands that cooked with memory and resourcefulness. Beef and mustard greens stir-fry was a Southern secret with a surprising twist of Asian inspiration, born from equal parts creativity and necessity. Ground beef sizzled in a hot skillet with chopped garlic, mustard greens, and a splash of vinegar that brightened everything instantly. A pinch of crushed red pepper brought just enough fire to make the dish sing. It all came together in minutes, the greens wilting and soaking up the rich, savory flavor of the beef. Served over a bed of hot rice, it managed to be bold, tangy, and deeply satisfying all at once. Every bite carried warmth, spice, and the taste of balance perfected by practice. This dish was quick and frugal, built for people who knew how to stretch what little they had and still make it memorable. It smelled like comfort, like hard work meeting reward, filling kitchens with the sound of sizzling success. There was pride in every pan, a kind of quiet victory only home cooks understood. It was proof that the simplest combinations, handled with care and confidence, could become something unforgettable. Proof that soul food and ingenuity were always the best seasoning of all. Watermelon rind stew reflects the creativity and endurance of people forced to survive on the edges of the plantation food system. The sweet red fruit was usually reserved for those in the owner's household, but the pale green rind, often thrown away, became a valuable ingredient for the enslaved cooks who transformed scraps into nourishment. Strips of rind were simmered slowly with onions, garden herbs, and whatever seasoning could be gathered or traded, creating a mellow broth rich in minerals and gentle sweetness. This practice traveled forward in time, inspiring the pickled watermelon rind that remains a hallmark of Southern home kitchens today. The dish is more than a recipe. It is a record of resilience, showing how African culinary knowledge turned waste into sustenance and flavor. In modern celebrations of African American foodways, watermelon rind pickles and stews continue to honor those who preserved health and dignity through skilled cooking even when denied basic freedom. Hoppin' John on New Year's Day was once a dish of deep meaning, carrying the promise of good fortune into every household that served it. Black-eyed peas simmered with rice, onions, and smoky cured meat made for a meal that was both filling and symbolic. Families across the South would gather on the first day of the year, confident that a bowl of this humble combination could bring luck, health, and steady work in the months ahead. The peas represented coins, the rice suggested abundance, and the pork gave a sense of strength and perseverance. Elders passed down stories of how this recipe came from West African traditions that traveled through the Middle Passage and took root in Carolina kitchens. Children learned to stir the pot while listening to tales of ancestors who found comfort in its aroma after days of uncertainty. Today, many people know the name, but few carry on the ritual with the same devotion that once marked every New Year's morning across countless African American homes. In the 1960s, fatback and cabbage was a reminder that flavor did not come from abundance, but from knowing how to cook with care. It was a dish that taught respect for every part of the animal and every leaf from the garden. Pork, fatback, and cabbage turned scraps into sustenance. Vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was one of the cleverest ways to turn leftovers into a comforting meal. My grandmother gathered whatever vegetables were left from the week, beans, carrots, peas, or turnips, and simmered them in a simple gravy. She poured the mixture into a dish and covered it with biscuit dough instead of pie crust, which baked into a golden, fluffy topping. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, stretching scraps into something that felt like a Sunday supper. Each slice carried both thrift and comfort, a reminder that nothing from the kitchen was wasted. The biscuit crust gave the dish substance, making it a true dinner instead of just a side. In the 1960s, vegetable pot pie with biscuit crust was common across homes that relied on ingenuity, turning odds and ends into meals that filled plates and warmed hearts. It was survival, wrapped in comfort. Food that told the story of resourceful families making the most of what they had.
Corned beef and cabbage with okra was the southern variation that added texture and flavor unique to the region. Fresh okra was sliced and added to the pot during the last 30 minutes of cooking, releasing its natural thickening agents into the broth. The okra became tender but maintained its shape, providing a vegetable that children either loved or learned to tolerate. Families who grew okra in their gardens added it to everything, including corned beef and cabbage. The dish became slightly thicker and more complex with the okra's subtle flavor. Some cooks fried the okra separately, first to reduce the sliminess, then added it to the pot. This variation showed how regional ingredients naturally found their way into adopted recipes, making them feel like they had always belonged together.
Beef and hominy skillet supper was a dish shaped by older cooks who knew how to make simple ingredients taste like something much bigger. Hominy brought a chewy, hearty texture that filled out the meal without costing much. When mixed with ground beef browned alongside onions, garlic, and sweet peppers, the skillet turned into a blend of smoky, savory flavors that tasted deeper than the recipe looked. Some grandparents added a pinch of chili powder, others added paprika or broth, and everyone seemed to have a special way of getting the seasoning just right. Hominy soaked in the beef juices, carrying the smoky undertone that made the dish memorable. The skillet fed many without draining the pantry, making it a dependable supper during lean years. Meals like this spoke to the creativity of older generations who learned to stretch ingredients with care and confidence. Beef and hominy skillet supper was humble but unforgettable, the kind of food that made families feel full in more ways than one. Turnip and potato hash was a skillet meal that worked wonders when meat was scarce or simply unavailable. Families would dice turnips and potatoes, fry them together in drippings or lard, and season them with onions, salt, and pepper. The combination produced a dish that was both hearty and inexpensive, making it a frequent breakfast or supper in households trying to stretch limited supplies. Turnips were especially important because they were cheap, easy to grow, and available in gardens or local markets. Blended with potatoes, they created bulk without requiring meat to make a plate feel substantial. This hash was also flexible, with families adding whatever scraps of vegetables they had on hand to improve flavor. Though simple, it offered warmth and familiarity to those who often faced uncertainty at mealtime. Turnip and potato hash might not have been glamorous, but it carried families through tough years and gave comfort with every bite. Pickled watermelon rind was a dish born out of a waste-not spirit. When families ate fresh watermelon, they saved the rinds, slicing off the tough green skin and brining the white flesh in vinegar, sugar, and spices. The result was a tangy, sweet pickle that could be eaten alongside meats, beans, or cornbread. In hard times, nothing edible was thrown away, and this recipe proved that even scraps could become something delicious. Pickled rind added brightness to plates that were otherwise heavy with starch and salt, lifting meals and making them feel more balanced. Children loved the odd flavor, and adults appreciated that it stretched food supplies further. Pickled watermelon rind became common in many Southern households, passed down as a recipe of ingenuity. It turned what was once destined for the trash into something cherished, embodying the creativity of Black families making do with what they had. Roasted chestnuts carried warmth and nourishment through the cold months when plantation rations were meager and gardens lay dormant. Enslaved families foraged chestnut trees that grew wild in the surrounding woods, gathering the smooth brown nuts and roasting them in hearth ashes or iron skillets until their shells cracked and the sweet flesh softened. The nuts' high energy content and natural sweetness made it an important source of calories and comfort, especially during long winter evenings. Roasted chestnuts became part of a wider African American food tradition, appearing in holiday celebrations and roadside markets after emancipation. Their gentle flavor paired well with cornmeal breads and simple stews, and many families passed down techniques for roasting and storing them long after the plantation era ended. Today, roasted chestnuts sold at winter festivals and city street corners carry echoes of that history, reminding us that what began as a survival practice also nurtured community and seasonal ritual for generations who transformed hardship into enduring culture.
Corned beef and cabbage with dill was the herb variation that added brightness and freshness to the familiar combination. Fresh or dried dill was stirred into the pot during the final minutes of cooking, its distinctive flavor permeating the broth and clinging to the vegetables. The herb's slight licorice note complemented the salt of the meat and cut through the richness. Families who grew dill in their gardens added it to everything from pickles to soups. The combination was especially refreshing in warmer months when something lighter was craved. Dill also appeared as a garnish, scattered fresh over the finished dish for color and aroma. This variation showed
ground beef corn fritters were the kind of treat grandparents fried up for gatherings, late-night snacks, or afternoons when children crowded the kitchen hoping for something warm and crispy. Cornmeal batter formed the base, mixed with sweet kernels of corn and seasoned ground beef. Spoonfuls of the mixture hit the hot oil and puffed into golden fritters, crisp on the outside and soft within. The beef added richness, the corn added sweetness, and together they made a flavor that felt both playful and comforting. Fritters were easy to make, easy to share, and always disappeared quickly from the plate. They carried the spirit of community, of family kitchens where food meant connection. Ground beef corn fritters were humble, joyful bites of memory. Fried corn pone was a dish that required almost nothing but cornmeal, water, and lard, yet it managed to fill stomachs during times of want. It was denser than cornbread and more rustic, formed into small patties and fried in cast-iron skillets until golden. Families leaned on it for breakfast, lunch, or supper because it was inexpensive, used ingredients they almost always had, and could be made quickly. Corn was abundant across the South, and every pantry had a sack of cornmeal that could be stretched into meals again and again. Eating fried corn pone often meant there was no wheat bread to be had, but no one went hungry. It was eaten with beans, dipped in potlikker, or just on its own with a smear of molasses or syrup if available. Fried corn pone reflected the determination to create something warm and satisfying even when the cupboards were close to bare. Wild grape connected plantation kitchens to the native abundance of the American South. Muscadine and scuppernong grapes grew untended along fences and forest edges, providing a dependable late summer harvest. Enslaved workers gathered the clusters and crushed them by hand to create a tangy juice that could be fermented slightly for a refreshing drink or boiled into a syrupy must used to season grains and greens. This technique echoed West African traditions of using fruit reductions to brighten savory dishes. After emancipation, muscadine wine and homemade grape jellies became hallmarks of Southern foodways, and small farms still produce them today. The careful gathering and slow simmering required patience and skill, qualities that defined the cooking of those who made the most of every wild resource. Wild grape stands as both a practical recipe and a testament to how African American cooks merged Old World techniques with New World ingredients, leaving a flavor that continues to shape regional preserves and beverages across the Carolinas and Georgia. Homemade cracklin bread filled kitchens with the savory perfume of pork fat and toasted cornmeal. Families saved every scrap of rendered pork skin, frying it until crisp and then folding the cracklings into cornbread batter rich with buttermilk and a touch of lard. Baked in a well-seasoned skillet, The bread emerged with a crisp crust and pockets of salty crunch that delighted children and elders alike. It was a dish born of necessity, ensuring nothing from the hog went to waste, but it also became a treat that people looked forward to at Sunday dinners. Neighbors often traded cracklings after a hog killing, turning the preparation into a social event that celebrated thrift and flavor. Today, store-bought cornbread mixes rarely capture the depth or texture of the old-style cracklin bread, and few families still render their own pork. For those who have tasted it, the memory of that smoky, savory slice remains a reminder of community resourcefulness and the joy of making something extraordinary from humble ingredients. Pumpkin stew with onions was the kind of dish that proved homegrown vegetables could anchor a meal. Pumpkins were easy to plant, easy to store, and yielded enough flesh to keep a family fed for weeks. My grandmother peeled chunks of pumpkin, cooked them down with onions, and let the pot simmer until it turned thick and savory. The sweetness of the pumpkin mixed with the sharpness of onion, creating a balance that felt hearty and satisfying. Sometimes she added a little pepper or a leftover bone for extra flavor, but even plain, the stew was filling. Served with bread or cornbread, it was enough to feed a household without meat or costly ingredients. In the 1960s, pumpkins were not just for pies or holidays, they were staples, pulled from backyard gardens and turned into supper. The stew carried warmth, thrift, and creativity in every spoonful. Pumpkin stew with onions showed that survival did not mean going without taste, only learning to love what the land gave freely. Molasses-glazed meatballs were sticky, sweet, and unforgettable, a proud staple of church potlucks and backyard cookouts during the 1970s. Ground beef was rolled by hand into tender rounds, browned carefully, and then simmered in a rich glaze of molasses, mustard, and vinegar. The sauce thickened slowly, dark and glossy, clinging to each meatball like syrup catching sunlight. The flavor was a dance. Sweetness first, then the smoke of the beef, followed by a tang that left you wanting more. Served warm over rice or speared with toothpicks, they were food meant to gather people, to make a table feel full and joyful. The shine on them was more than just glaze. It was pride, a reflection of care and craft. These meatballs carried memory in every bite, from kitchen laughter to gospel songs heard through open windows. They were food made to be shared, to remind everyone that a little sweetness could turn any meal into a celebration of community and love. Homemade cracklins were a prized treat made from pork skins, fried until golden and crisp. Families would render down hog fat and save the skins, cutting them into pieces that crackled in hot lard as they cooked. The result was crunchy, salty, and deeply flavorful, often eaten with cornbread or sprinkled over greens. Nothing went to waste, and cracklins were proof of how families found ways to enjoy even the humblest scraps. They carried a strong connection to hog butchering days, when entire communities gathered to process a hog and share every part of it. Cracklins added texture and flavor to otherwise plain meals, and for many, they were a reminder of both thrift and celebration. Though inexpensive, they carried a sense of richness and taste that lifted spirits. Homemade cracklins showed how food could be both practical and deeply satisfying, even in the hardest of times. Pokeweed greens offered one of the first fresh tastes of spring for people living with few supplies after a long winter. Young pokeweed shoots emerged early and plentifully, but they carried natural toxins that required careful boiling in several changes of water. Enslaved cooks, drawing on African knowledge of wild plants, mastered this technique to create a tender, spinach-like dish that supplied vital vitamins when gardens were only beginning to grow. Seasoned with a bit of salt pork or a sprinkle of wild herbs, poke greens became a welcome sign of the changing season. Long after emancipation, poke salad festivals in Appalachia and the Deep South celebrated this once humble plant, turning a survival ingredient into a community tradition. The careful preparation taught by generations of African American cooks is still followed today, preserving both safety and flavor. Pokeweed greens remind us that deep botanical knowledge and patient cooking transformed a potentially dangerous weed into nourishing food that helped sustain families through the hardest times. Cowpea and collard stew combined two powerhouse ingredients that sustained countless families through hard times. Field peas, also known as cowpeas, were simmered slowly with smoky meat and joined by hearty collard greens, creating a dish rich in protein, vitamins, and earthy flavor. The long cooking process filled homes with an aroma that signaled comfort and nourishment. Farmers valued cowpeas for their ability to thrive in poor soil, while collards offered leaves long after other vegetables had withered. Together, they made a meal that cost little but fed many, reflecting a tradition of resourcefulness and care. Mothers and grandmothers seasoned the pot with onions, garlic, and pepper, each adding a personal touch passed down through generations. Families gathered around the table with slices of cornbread to soak up the flavorful broth, finding strength in every spoonful. Though supermarkets now offer endless choices, the slow-simmered union of cowpeas and collards stands as a reminder of a time when simple ingredients created enduring nourishment. Fish head stew was a dish born out of necessity, yet it carried surprising depth and flavor. Fish heads, often discarded by others, were simmered slowly with onions, potatoes, and rice until they yielded every ounce of richness to the broth. My grandmother insisted the heads made the stew better than fillets, providing body and nourishment that nothing else could. The bones and skin flavored the liquid until it turned hearty and comforting. Potatoes stretched the meal, rice thickened it, and vegetables added substance, turning scraps into a filling supper. The taste was strong, earthy, and unforgettable, reminding everyone that no part of food should go unused. For Black families in the 1960s, fish head stew was a common way to stretch the catch of the day, ensuring nothing went to waste. It became a lesson in thrift and gratitude, proof that survival demanded creativity. Fish head stew was both humble and mighty, sustaining families through lean times with flavor and tradition. Hamburger steak and onions with rice was the definition of comfort on a plate, proof that simplicity could taste like luxury when made with care. Ground beef was shaped into thick, solid patties and fried in cast iron until seared dark and crisp on the edges. Then came the onions, sliced thin, cooked low and slow in the same skillet until golden and soft, soaking up every bit of beef flavor. The pan drippings were stirred into a quick gravy, poured steaming over hot white rice. The scent of caramelized onions drifted through the house, sweet and smoky at once, wrapping everyone in quiet anticipation. Families called it steak, not out of pretense, but out of respect, because this meal carried dignity in every bite. It was rich, savory, and deeply satisfying, the kind of food that silenced a room once the first fork was lifted. The balance of salt, heat, and sweetness lingered long after the meal was over. There was pride in its simplicity, beauty in its thrift. It was not just food, it was tradition, resilience, and care served over rice. Sweet potato biscuits with honey were a beloved comfort food that turned humble ingredients into something special. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in the South, cheap to grow, and full of natural sweetness. By mashing them into biscuit dough, families created soft, tender breads that did not require as much flour or fat. Fresh biscuits out of the oven were topped with a drizzle of local honey if it was available, making them feel indulgent despite their simplicity. These biscuits were often served for breakfast, but they could also accompany stews or fried fish. They filled stomachs and brought warmth to the table, offering both nutrition and comfort. Sweet potatoes symbolized resilience, and honey added a touch of hope in difficult times. Together, they created a dish that carried meaning well beyond its taste. Sweet potato biscuits with honey reflected the heart of soul food, making something beautiful and memorable from ingredients that were always within reach. Ground pumpkin seed. Porridge transformed leftover seeds into a hearty meal that supplied both protein and healthy oils. After pumpkins were cooked for pies or stews, the seeds were washed, dried, and pounded into a coarse meal. This meal was simmered slowly in water or thin milk, creating a creamy porridge with a subtle nutty flavor. Sweetened lightly with honey or molasses when available, it became a sustaining breakfast or evening dish that used every part of the harvest. The method reflected West African culinary traditions where ground seeds thickened soups and stews, showing how transplanted knowledge enriched American foodways. Generations after emancipation, pumpkin seed porridge remained a seasonal specialty in some rural areas, appreciated for its nourishing qualities and gentle taste. Modern cooks might recognize it in contemporary seed-based milks and cereals, proving that this centuries-old practice still influences how we eat today. Ground pumpkin seed porridge highlights the wisdom of never wasting what nature provides and celebrates a heritage of careful resourcefulness that continues to inspire. Okra and tomato succotash brought color and heritage together in one bubbling skillet. Fresh okra pods, sliced thin, mingled with sweet ripe tomatoes, corn kernels, onions, and peppers, creating a medley that linked West African traditions with Native American harvests. The dish simmered until the vegetables melded into a savory stew, thickened naturally by the okra's silken texture. Farmers' markets once overflowed with the ingredients every late summer, and families counted on succotash to stretch their crops and fill their tables. It was a side dish that could stand as a main course when meat was scarce, and its bright flavors paired beautifully with cornbread or rice. Elders told stories of ancestors who carried seeds and memories across oceans and frontiers, weaving history into every spoonful. Though many still grow okra and corn, the slow, careful preparation of true succotash has become rare, replaced by frozen blends and quick sautés that cannot match the patient flavor of the old garden skillet. Which forgotten ground beef dish would you bring back to your family's table? Drop your favorite in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more lost flavors from the past.